military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. The move comes less than a day after the country's foreign minister met with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Taiwan's foreign ministry says it seeks peaceful solutions to disputes in the South China Sea and condemns hostile actions by China.
At first glance, it looked like a routine diplomatic statement. On July 12, 2026, Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs reaffirmed its long-standing position on the South China Sea. Its sovereignty claims, it said, remained unchanged. Nothing unusual. But then came the wording that caught Beijing's attention. Taipei called for disputes to be resolved peacefully under international law.
我们是希望能够积极的来促进这个和平的解决争议，那也能够以这个就是包括对于这个海洋的科研。
It opposed unilateral expansion, gray zone coercion, and militarization, and pledged to work with like-minded countries to safeguard freedom of navigation and maintain a free, open, and stable Indo-Pacific. Those words immediately stood out because they closely echoed concerns that the Philippines, Japan, the United States, and other regional partners have repeatedly raised about China's growing maritime activities.
For me, this is just the usual harassment of the Chinese government.
We have real concerns about behaviour that is destabilising and risky.
Just days later, Taiwan also reported a sharp increase in Chinese Coast Guard activity around the island, reinforcing concerns that Beijing's pressure was expanding across multiple fronts.
Taiwan has accused China of violating its sovereignty for sending a research vessel into Taiwan's exclusive economic zone.
So, was Taiwan changing its South China Sea policy? Not exactly. And that's where this story becomes far more interesting. For decades, Taiwan and China have disagreed on almost everything. Different governments, different political systems, different visions for the future.
中华人民共和国无权代表台湾。
Yet there was one issue where they appeared to share remarkably similar positions: the South China Sea. Both inherited historical claims dating back to the Republic of China. Both continue to claim sovereignty over islands in the region, including Taipei Island, the largest naturally formed feature in the Spratly Islands. So why are analysts increasingly saying Taiwan is moving closer to the Philippines, even though it has never abandoned those historical claims? The answer lies in a little-known chapter of history that changes how this entire story is understood. To understand Taiwan's position today, we have to go back to 1947. Here's the part that surprises most people. The 9-dash line didn't originally come from the People's Republic of China. It came from the Republic of China, or ROC, the government that ruled China before the communists came to power. In 1947, the ROC published an official map of the South China Sea marked by the 11-dash line, laying out its territorial claims years before the People's Republic of China even existed. Then history took a dramatic turn. After losing the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the ROC government retreated to Taiwan, while Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China on the mainland. From that moment, two rival governments emerged. Both claimed to represent China. Both inherited the same historical map. But over time, their paths began to diverge. Beijing later revised the original 11-dash line into today's 9-dash line. Taiwan never adopted that version. Instead, it continued to uphold the Republic of China's original historical claims. The clearest example is Taipei Island, also known as Itu Aba. Nearly 1,600 kilometers south of Taiwan, this tiny island is the largest naturally formed feature in the Spratly Islands. Taiwan has administered it for decades, maintaining a Coast Guard presence, an airstrip, and civilian facilities. Here's the irony. Taiwan has never abandoned its South China Sea claims. Yet it also supports resolving disputes peacefully under international law, protecting freedom of navigation, and avoiding military escalation. At first glance, that sounds contradictory, but it reveals something much more important. Taiwan and China may still claim many of the same islands. What they no longer share is the same strategic vision. And that raises an even bigger question. If Taiwan's claims in the South China Sea haven't fundamentally changed, what has? The answer isn't Taiwan. It's China. Over the past decade, Beijing has steadily transformed the security environment around the island. Almost daily, Chinese fighter jets cross into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Warships circle nearby waters. Large-scale military exercises now routinely simulate blockades and encirclement operations, rehearsing scenarios that once seemed unthinkable. But the most significant change isn't always made by fighter jets or destroyers. It's made by ships painted white. China's Coast Guard has become one of Beijing's most effective tools for what analysts call gray zone tactics, operations designed to increase pressure without triggering open war. And the scale of that campaign is growing. According to Taiwan's Coast Guard, 55 Chinese government vessels, including Coast Guard cutters and research ships, were detected operating around Taiwan in June 2026. That was an 83% increase in just 1 month, and more than double the number recorded a year earlier. Taiwanese officials say these aren't ordinary patrols. Some of China's largest Coast Guard ships are former naval destroyers, refitted for law enforcement missions. Others have reportedly questioned commercial vessels at sea, while Taiwan has instructed those ships to ignore Chinese radio broadcasts and continue their voyages. Individually, these incidents may seem routine. Together, they reveal a different strategy. Rather than relying solely on military force, Beijing is using Coast Guard patrols, maritime law enforcement, research vessels, and constant military activity to gradually reshape the status quo, one encounter at a time, without crossing the threshold into open conflict. For Taiwan, that has changed everything. The immediate challenge is no longer simply defending historical claims in the South China Sea. It is responding to a security environment where military pressure, law enforcement, and psychological signaling increasingly work together. And that helps explain why Taiwan is finding more common ground with countries like the Philippines. Its territorial claims may be rooted in history, but its security concerns are firmly focused on the future. If Taiwan and the Philippines aren't allies, why does Beijing seem so concerned whenever they grow closer? The answer lies in how modern geopolitics works. Countries don't need formal diplomatic relations to become strategically important to one another. And Taiwan and the Philippines have far more in common than many people realize. Both sit along the first island chain, a string of islands stretching from Japan through Taiwan and the Philippines that occupies one of the most strategically significant regions in the Indo-Pacific. Both rely on the same sea lanes for trade. Both depend on freedom of navigation. And both have watched China's military and Coast Guard become increasingly active in the waters around them. That doesn't mean Taipei and Manila have formed a military alliance. They haven't. Nor do they agree on every territorial issue in the South China Sea. They don't. But shared security concerns have quietly expanded cooperation in other ways. Trade and investment have continued to grow as companies diversify supply chains across Asia. Taiwan's semiconductor industry and the Philippines' manufacturing sector have become increasingly complementary, creating stronger economic links between the two economies. People have strengthened those ties as well. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos live and work in Taiwan, supporting industries ranging from healthcare to advanced manufacturing. Education, tourism, and business exchanges have also continued to deepen despite the absence of formal diplomatic relations. Taken individually, none of these developments appears extraordinary. Taken together, they tell a different story. Two governments without formal diplomatic ties are gradually becoming more connected through economics, people, and shared security interests. And that's precisely what Beijing notices. From China's perspective, influence isn't measured only by military alliances. It's measured by networks. Every new partnership, every stronger economic relationship, and every shared strategic concern along the first island chain makes the regional environment more complex. That's why even a carefully worded statement from Taipei can draw such close attention in Beijing. Because the real story isn't about a single diplomatic statement. It's about a relationship that has been quietly evolving for years. On July 12, 2026, Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a statement on the South China Sea. At first glance, it looked like business as usual. Taiwan reaffirmed that its sovereignty claims over the South China Sea remained unchanged. It also repeated a position it has maintained for years, that disputes should be resolved peacefully under international law. including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. Nothing surprising. Then the tone began to change. Taipei openly opposed unilateral expansionism, gray zone coercion, and militarization, warning that such actions threaten regional peace and stability. It also called on all parties to respect international law and safeguard freedom of navigation and overflight through one of the world's busiest maritime corridors. Then came the line that drew the most attention. Taiwan declared that it would continue working with like-minded countries and regional partners to preserve a free, open, peaceful, and stable Indo-Pacific. That sentence may have sounded diplomatic, but in geopolitics, wording matters. Although Taiwan never mentioned the Philippines by name, its language closely echoed positions that the Philippines, Japan, the United States, Australia, and other Indo-Pacific partners have repeatedly taken in response to China's growing maritime activities. This is where headlines and diplomacy begin to part ways. Many media reports portrayed the statement as Taiwan backing the Philippines. Officially, that isn't what happened. Taiwan did not endorse Philippine sovereignty claims, nor did it abandon its own historical claims in the South China Sea. Instead, it reaffirmed its sovereignty claims while emphasizing peaceful dispute resolution, adherence to international law, opposition to coercion, and cooperation with countries seeking regional stability. For Beijing, however, that legal distinction was almost beside the point. China has long opposed any development that brings Taiwan into closer alignment with other regional governments. From Beijing's perspective, the significance of the statement wasn't a change in Taiwan's territorial claims. It was the diplomatic language it chose to use, and the broader strategic community it appeared to identify with. The issue was no longer just about the South China Sea. It was about where Taiwan increasingly appeared to position itself within the Indo-Pacific security landscape.
权利主张及行使自身合法权益造成任何影响。
At this point, the story seems almost paradoxical. Taiwan still controls Taiping Island. It has never abandoned its historical claims in the South China Sea. So why did Beijing react so strongly to Taiwan's statement? Because today's competition is no longer just about who claims the islands. It's about how those claims are pursued. Taiwan's July 2026 statement reaffirmed its sovereignty claims. But it also emphasized something Beijing increasingly rejects: resolving disputes peacefully under international law, protecting freedom of navigation, opposing gray zone coercion, and working with like-minded partners to preserve regional stability. That marks a clear difference in approach. Beijing argues that many of these disputes should be settled primarily through direct negotiations and continues to reject the 2016 South China Sea arbitration, which concluded that China's 9-dash line has no legal basis under UNCLOS. Then comes another unexpected twist. Taiwan also rejected part of that same ruling. But not for the same reason as China. The tribunal ruled that Taiping Island, despite being the largest naturally formed feature in the Spratly Islands, should legally be classified as a ROC, not a fully entitled island. That meant it would not generate a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone under Article 121 of UNCLOS. Taiwan rejected that conclusion because it directly affects territory that Taipei continues to administer. So yes, both Taiwan and China rejected part of the same ruling, but that's where their similarities largely end. Taiwan increasingly speaks about a rules-based international order, peaceful dispute resolution, and cooperation with democratic partners. China, meanwhile, continues expanding its military presence, Coast Guard operations, and gray zone activities across both the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. And that's what Beijing is really watching. Look at a map of East Asia. From Japan through Taiwan, down to the Philippines, and across to Australia, a network of countries is strengthening security cooperation, expanding military access, sharing intelligence, and coordinating more closely than before. The Philippines is expanding access to bases under EDCA. Japan is reinforcing its southwestern defenses. The United States continues to deepen its Indo-Pacific presence. And while Taiwan has no formal military alliance with any of them, its diplomatic language is increasingly aligned with many of the same principles. Military planners often describe this broader strategy as integrated deterrence. not one alliance, but a network of partners whose combined political, economic, and security cooperation raises the cost of aggression. From Beijing's perspective, that's the real challenge. It's not that Taiwan still claims islands in the South China Sea. It's that Taiwan is becoming increasingly connected to a wider regional network that shares many of the same security concerns. And that's why this story was never really about an old map. It's about who will shape the future security order of the Indo-Pacific. If the Philippines cannot officially recognize Taiwan, why deepen ties at all? The answer is simple. Manila isn't looking for another military alliance. It's looking for more options. The Philippines continues to recognize the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China under its One China policy, and it maintains no formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. That hasn't changed. What has changed is the region around it. As competition across the Indo-Pacific intensifies, the Philippines has increasingly sought to strengthen relationships wherever its interests align. Taiwan is one of those partners. Politically, Taiwan's support for international law, peaceful dispute resolution, and opposition to coercion reinforces many of the same principles that Manila has championed since the 2016 South China Sea arbitration. While Taipei does not endorse Philippine sovereignty claims, another regional voice supporting a rules-based maritime order strengthens the broader diplomatic narrative. The benefits extend beyond diplomacy. Taiwan is one of the world's leading technology economies and home to the global semiconductor industry. As companies diversify supply chains, the Philippines hopes to attract greater Taiwanese investment in electronics, advanced manufacturing, and other high-value industries, bringing jobs, technology, and new opportunities. The relationship is also built on people. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos live and work in Taiwan, contributing to healthcare, manufacturing, shipping, and other critical industries. Those long-standing personal and economic ties have created a relationship that extends well beyond official diplomacy. Then there's the strategic reality. Neither Taiwan nor the Philippines has a formal defense agreement with the other, but both rely on secure sea lanes. Both face growing maritime pressure, and both would benefit from greater cooperation in areas such as disaster response, maritime awareness, fisheries management, and the resilience of critical infrastructure. For Manila, this isn't about choosing between Beijing and Taipei. It's about reducing strategic dependence on any single partner. In today's Indo-Pacific, resilience comes from having more economic connections, more diplomatic channels, and more trusted partners. And that's why Beijing watches this relationship so closely. Not because Taiwan and the Philippines have become allies, but because even limited cooperation can gradually reshape the strategic landscape. So where does this go from here? No one knows for certain. The future of Taiwan-Philippines relations won't be decided only in Taipei or Manila. It will also depend on decisions made in Beijing, Washington, Tokyo, and capitals across the Indo-Pacific. But based on current trends, three futures appear more likely than the others. The first is continuity. This is also the most likely outcome. Taiwan and the Philippines continue expanding practical cooperation while carefully avoiding steps that could dramatically alter the regional balance. Taipei keeps advocating international law, freedom of navigation, and peaceful dispute resolution. Manila continues strengthening ties with democratic partners while maintaining its One China policy and avoiding formal diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. The relationship grows, quietly, steadily, without crossing Beijing's political red lines. The second future is deeper unofficial cooperation, not an alliance, but something more substantial than today's relationship. Trade could expand in advanced manufacturing and semiconductor industries. Maritime agencies could cooperate more closely on fisheries, disaster response, search and rescue, and maritime domain awareness. Universities, businesses, and technology sectors could build even stronger connections. None of that would require formal diplomatic recognition. Yet together, those seemingly small steps could create a much more resilient partnership. The third possibility is greater pressure from Beijing. This is also the most unpredictable. If China expands military exercises around Taiwan, increases Coast Guard activity in the South China Sea, or applies greater diplomatic and economic pressure on governments engaging with Taipei. Both Taiwan and the Philippines may face increasingly difficult choices. Regional partners could respond by strengthening their own coordination, accelerating exactly the kind of strategic networking Beijing hopes to discourage. That doesn't mean conflict is inevitable. Far from it. But it does suggest that competition across the Indo-Pacific is unlikely to ease anytime soon. And that brings us to the biggest takeaway from this entire story. Perhaps this was never really about Taiwan and the Philippines alone. Perhaps it is about something much larger. The gradual emergence of a new security architecture across the Indo-Pacific. At first glance, this seemed like a story about Taiwan backing the Philippines in the South China Sea. But that was never the whole story. Taiwan has not abandoned its historical claims, nor has it formally endorsed Philippine sovereignty. What has changed is the strategic environment around both. As China's military, Coast Guard, and gray zone activities continue to expand across the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan and the Philippines have found increasing common ground, not in territorial claims, but in their support for international law, regional stability, and a rules-based maritime order. And that is likely why Beijing paid such close attention to a carefully worded diplomatic statement. Because the real issue was never just the statement itself. It was what that statement represented. For decades, the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea were often viewed as separate geopolitical flashpoints. Today, they are becoming increasingly interconnected. The decisions made in one theater are beginning to shape the strategic calculations in the other. That may prove to be one of the defining geopolitical shifts of the Indo-Pacific in the years ahead. Can Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines really deter China? That's the question sitting quietly behind almost every strategic conversation in East Asia right now. Not can they defeat China, not can they outspend China, but can they deter it? Can three very different actors, one economic heavyweight, one frontline island democracy, and one Southeast Asian maritime state, together create enough friction to make Beijing pause? Because deterrence isn't about theatrics. It's about calculation. It's about whether the cost of action starts to look uncomfortably high.
全国各族人民传承和弘扬伟大抗战精神，中华民族伟大复兴势不可挡。
And if there is a backbone in this emerging triangle, it's Japan. Japan is the only one of the three with full-spectrum advanced military capability. That matters. It fields a highly modern navy, advanced air assets, missile defense systems, and increasingly sophisticated counter-strike capabilities. It operates in the same technological league as top-tier Western militaries. That gives the triangle structural depth. Economically, Japan is still a giant. With a GDP of roughly $4.2 trillion, it remains one of the largest economies in the world. And unlike smaller regional actors, Japan has the fiscal capacity to sustain prolonged competition. Defense spending is on a clear upward trajectory, projected around $75 billion in 2025, with a commitment to reach 2% of GDP by 2027. That shift alone represents one of the most significant strategic pivots in post-war Japanese history. But what really sets Japan apart is its industrial base. Shipbuilding, aerospace engineering, advanced missile systems, radar technologies, semiconductor production. These aren't abstract strengths. They translate directly into military resilience and supply chain security. In long-term competition, the side that can manufacture, repair, and innovate consistently tends to endure. And here's something important. Japan isn't just building for itself anymore. It's increasingly enabling partners. Through security assistance, defense technology cooperation, and operational integration, Tokyo is multiplying capability across the region. That's a quiet force multiplier. If deterrence in East Asia is going to work, it requires credibility. Japan provides that credibility. It has alliance depth with the United States, growing operational alignment with the Philippines, and strategic stakes tied directly to Taiwan's security.
我衷心期盼台湾和日本能够在经济、安全、高科技产业以及强化社会韧性等领域持续深化合作，共同努力实现自由开放的印度太平洋的愿景。
Instability in the Taiwan Strait would immediately impact Japan's southwestern islands and its sea lines of communication. So when we ask whether this triangle can deter China, the first variable is whether Japan remains committed, capable, and strategically steady. Right now, the answer appears to be yes. The deeper question is whether Japan's strength, when combined with Taiwan's geographic centrality and the Philippines' maritime positioning, creates enough integrated resistance to shift Beijing's risk calculus. That's where this becomes interesting. Now let's get specific about the hard power, because when we talk about deterrence, ships and submarines matter. A lot. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force isn't symbolic. It's operationally serious. Japan fields roughly 50 major surface combatants. That's not a token fleet. These are modern destroyers and frigates equipped with advanced sensors, anti-submarine warfare systems, and integrated air defense capabilities. They are built for high-end maritime conflict, not just patrol duty. Then there are the 8 Aegis-equipped destroyers. That's a big deal. Aegis systems provide ballistic missile defense capability, meaning Japan can detect, track, and potentially intercept incoming missile threats. In a regional environment where missile inventories are expanding rapidly, that defensive layer is crucial. It complicates any adversary's first strike assumptions. Below the surface, Japan operates around 22 advanced diesel-electric submarines, including the Sri and newer Taipei classes. These boats are quiet, extremely quiet. Optimized for operating in the complex undersea geography of the East China Sea and surrounding waters. In maritime deterrence, submarines are psychological weapons as much as physical ones. You don't know exactly where they are, and that uncertainty forces caution. And then there are the 2 Izumo-class helicopter carriers. They're being modified to operate F-35B short takeoff and vertical landing fighters. That transformation effectively gives Japan light aircraft carrier capability. It extends air power projection beyond land-based airfields and enhances flexibility in crisis scenarios, especially around the Ryukyu Island chain and potentially in support of broader regional contingencies. Put simply, Japan operates one of the most capable navies in Asia outside the United States. That's not hype, it's structural reality. For any deterrence framework involving Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, Japan provides the blue water backbone. It brings advanced anti-air, anti-submarine, and missile defense capabilities. It brings logistics depth. It brings industrial sustainment. Without Japan, the triangle would feel fragile. With Japan, it becomes something much harder to ignore. Japan's air power is another critical piece of the deterrence puzzle, and it's easy to underestimate just how capable it is. The Japanese Air Self-Defense Force fields over 300 modern fighters, and that number is not static. Japan is actively acquiring F-35s, both the A and B variants, with plans for over 140 in total. That's stealth-capable, multi-role aircraft with sensor fusion, long-range strike capability, and survivability in contested airspaces. The F-35B, in particular, when deployed from the Izumo-class carriers, allows Japan to project air power beyond the mainland, which is a game-changer for regional flexibility. On top of that, Japan has advanced ISR and early warning systems integrated into its air defense network. Think radar, airborne warning and control, satellite intelligence, and electronic warfare assets all connected in near real time. This gives Japan not just fighters, but situational awareness, the ability to detect, track, and respond to threats before they become crises. Japan's air power complements its naval capabilities perfectly. Destroyers and submarines control the seas, carriers and fighters control the skies, and ISR systems tie everything together. For deterrence, it's the combination of visibility, rapid response, and strike credibility that really counts. In short, Japan doesn't just have planes, it has the eyes, the reach, and the teeth to make any adversary think twice before escalating. Japan's security posture has shifted dramatically in recent years. The 2022 National Security Strategy signaled a move from reactive defense to structured deterrence. Tokyo is now acquiring counterstrike capabilities, including Tomahawk land attack missiles, and expanding its long-range missile arsenal. This isn't just about defense. It's about signaling that Japan can respond to threats with credible, preemptive precision if necessary. Japan's deep alliance with the United States remains central. It ensures operational interoperability, access to advanced technology, and extended deterrence. Beyond the bilateral US-Japan axis, Tokyo is increasingly engaging in trilateral exercises with the Philippines, often in waters adjacent to Taiwan. These exercises test coordination, strengthen readiness, and send clear signals to potential adversaries. Regional maritime security is a shared responsibility. Japan is actively transitioning from decades of reactive pacifism to a posture built on integrated deterrence, combining advanced hardware, operational alliances, and strategic signaling. Unlike Japan, Taiwan isn't focused on projecting power across oceans. Its strategy is denial, making any potential invasion so costly and risky that an adversary would hesitate before acting.
台湾是否为一个国家？根据国家主权4个要素，孩童金马，这是土地；定期改选各级政府执行公权力，这是政府，这是治权，并对外进行外交，拥有国防力量，这是主权。由这块土地上的2300万人民所组成的政治共同体，是不是一个国家？是国家的人举手一下来。谢谢你们，我们掌声为台湾喝彩。台湾当然是一个国家啊。
Taiwan's economy is smaller than Japan's, with a GDP of roughly $800 billion. But it punches far above its weight globally. Over 60% of the world's semiconductors come from Taiwan, and TSMC alone controls more than 90% of advanced chip production. That makes Taiwan not just a regional player, but a linchpin in the global technology supply chain. Conflict here would ripple worldwide, making Taiwan's security a matter of international economic interest. Personnel. Taiwan maintains an active force of about 170,000, supported by a reserve system that is currently being restructured. Conscription has been extended to 1 year, reflecting a push to improve readiness and build a more capable force. Taiwan fields Patriot PAC-3 systems and indigenous Skybow air defense, while expanding its stockpile of anti-ship missiles like the Xiongfeng-2 and 30. These systems are designed to protect critical infrastructure, ports, and airfields from long-range attack. Taiwan operates 4 submarines with new indigenous programs underway, maintains a large inventory of anti-ship cruise missiles, mobile coastal defense units, sea mines, and fast attack craft. The overall doctrine is clear: deny access, raise the cost of invasion, and exploit geography and asymmetric tools to make aggression prohibitively expensive. In essence, Taiwan is a fortress built not for global reach, but for strategic denial. Its geography, technology, and military posture create a multi-layered shield designed to make any adversary think twice before attempting a landing. This combination of economic centrality and defensive military capability makes Taiwan a uniquely high-stakes actor in the deterrence triangle with Japan and the Philippines. The Philippines doesn't have the firepower of Japan or the high-tech defenses of Taiwan, but its strategic value is undeniable. Its strength lies in geography, controlling key maritime choke points that connect the South China Sea, the Philippine Sea, and the Bashi Channel. In a conflict scenario, this location can complicate Chinese naval movements and provide a critical advantage to allied forces coordinating in the region. Economically, the Philippines is smaller, with a GDP around $440 billion and a defense budget of roughly $4 or $5 billion, though it's gradually rising. Through the AFP modernization program, Manila is improving capabilities incrementally. It may not be able to project high-end power, but it is steadily building a force capable of layered deterrence and operational integration with partners. Militarily, the Philippines remains limited. Its Navy has few surface combatants, and its Air Force relies on FA-50 light fighters from South Korea. But recent investments in coastal radar and ISR systems, especially with Japanese assistance, are enhancing maritime domain awareness. Alongside 9 EDCA access sites with the U.S., these upgrades increase flexibility, readiness, and coordination with allied forces. Ultimately, the Philippines' geographic position is its true leverage. Sitting astride critical sea lanes, it can shape naval operations, influence the movement of forces, and serve as a crucial node in a broader trilateral deterrence framework alongside Japan and Taiwan. In strategic terms, location and cooperation can outweigh raw capability. China sits at the center of gravity in this regional equation. Its economy alone, with a GDP around $17–18 trillion, dwarfs its neighbors, and it is the largest trading partner for most of Asia. That economic reach translates into deep financial leverage across ASEAN, giving Beijing tools to influence policy and stability without firing a shot. Militarily, the People's Liberation Army is massive and rapidly modernizing. The PLAN is the largest navy in the world by ship count, with over 370 vessels, including 3 aircraft carriers. Liaoning, Shandong, and Fujian, dozens of destroyers and frigates, and an expanding submarine fleet, including nuclear-powered boats. Its missile arsenal, from DF-21D carrier killers to DF-26 intermediate-range missiles, forms a robust anti-access/area denial umbrella that complicates any approach. In the air, China fields more than 2,000 combat aircraft, including J-20 fifth-generation stealth fighters, giving it escalation dominance in localized conflicts near its coast. Deterrence depends on 3 variables: capability, credibility, and cohesion. Individually, Japan, Taiwan, or the Philippines cannot deter China. Japan brings high-end naval and air power, Taiwan brings hardened denial defenses, and the Philippines offers critical geographic choke points. Together, they don't match China's raw scale, but they create a complex operational puzzle, forcing Beijing to allocate resources across multiple fronts. The U.S. factor is decisive. Without Washington's backing, the triangle's deterrence potential drops dramatically. With U.S. integration, Japan's navy combines with American naval strength, the Philippines becomes a staging and logistics hub, and Taiwan's denial strategy gains credibility. The triangle only becomes a credible deterrent within a broader alliance framework. Operational geography further amplifies this. If coordinated, Japan controls northern access, Taiwan blocks the central Taiwan Strait, and the Philippines threatens the southern approach through the Bashi Channel. Multi-axis pressure increases costs and uncertainty for China, the very essence of deterrence. Yet the triangle has clear weaknesses. There is no formal trilateral defense treaty, political volatility in the Philippines, Taiwan's diplomatic isolation, Japan's constitutional constraints, and China's economic leverage over all 3. Cohesion remains fragile, and maintaining a consistent, coordinated posture is a challenge. So, can Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines deter China? Not independently. Possibly collectively. Credibly, only with U.S. integration. Deterrence here is not about defeating China outright. It is about raising the costs of aggression, complicating PLA operational planning, increasing escalation risks, and making conflict unpredictable and prolonged. The triangle's advantage is structural and layered, not symmetrical. Geography, alliance networks, asymmetric defense, maritime choke points, and integrated ISR and missile denial create friction. The real question isn't whether they can overpower China, it's whether they can make aggression irrational. And that, strategically, is exactly what deterrence is supposed to do.
菲方在涉台问题上不断采取错误挑衅言行，严重违反国际关系基本准则和在涉台问题上所作承诺。
Any attempt to expand military cooperation in areas surrounding Taiwan will be met with firm opposition, a spokesperson from China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China warned just days ago. And now here we are. Because the Philippines, long seen as a frontline state in the South China Sea, is reportedly considering deeper security coordination with Taiwan.
We cooperate with as many nations as we can. You know, we're closest to Taiwan, and we can accommodate others. But these are contingency plans. As military, as an armed forces, we have to be prepared for anything, for any possible scenario.
Naval transits through the Luzon Strait, possible joint patrol discussions, quiet conversations that are not so quiet anymore. Let's pause for a second. What happens when two of Asia's most combustible flashpoints, the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, start overlapping? This isn't just another routine defense dialogue. This feels different. The Luzon Strait, that narrow stretch of water between northern Philippines and Taiwan, has always been strategically important. But lately it feels like it's becoming the hinge of the entire Indo-Pacific chessboard. I keep thinking about geography, how sometimes a simple line on the map can change the fate of nations. Batanes is just a few hundred kilometers from Taiwan. Close enough that in a crisis, distance almost stops mattering. For years, Manila focused on the South China Sea disputes. Scarborough Shoal, Second Thomas Shoal, constant maritime standoffs with Chinese vessels. Now, if cooperation with Taipei moves forward, the Philippines would no longer be dealing with just one pressure point. It would be stepping into the Taiwan equation too. And that equation is far more explosive. On paper, this can be framed as defensive preparedness. It makes sense in one way. The Philippines wants contingency planning. It wants to avoid being caught off guard if conflict erupts near its northern waters. That's rational. Any sovereign state would think the same. But strategy isn't just about logic. It's about perception. Beijing views Taiwan as a core interest, not just another territorial issue, but a red line tied to sovereignty and national identity. The moment Manila is seen coordinating militarily with Taipei, even under the banner of humanitarian drills or maritime safety, the optics shift. The Philippines stops being just a South China Sea claimant. It becomes part of the Taiwan deterrence architecture. And that's a serious escalation. I can't help but think about how quickly tensions have already been rising. Water cannon incidents, close naval encounters, public accusations. Add Taiwan into that mix, and the security environment doesn't just become tense, it becomes layered. More actors, more miscalculations, more room for accidents. This potential shift intersects directly with broader US-China rivalry. Washington would likely welcome stronger Manila-Taipei coordination as part of regional deterrence. Beijing would interpret it as alignment against its strategic core. ASEAN states? They would watch carefully, some quietly anxious, others recalibrating their own hedging strategies. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Small moves in sensitive theaters often trigger disproportionate reactions. The Philippines may believe it is strengthening its security buffer, but it is also increasing its exposure. Economically, diplomatically, militarily. China remains one of its largest trading partners. The region is already stretched thin by great power competition. The margin for error is shrinking. So the question isn't whether Manila has the right to coordinate with whom it chooses. It does. The real question is this: is the Philippines prepared for the strategic gravity that comes with stepping into the Taiwan equation? Because once the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea begin to merge in operational terms, there's no clean separation anymore. No tidy diplomatic firewall. Just a tighter, more dangerous strategic knot in one of the world's most contested regions. If you pull up a map and really look at it, not just glance, the Luzon Strait almost jumps out at you. It's not wide, not dramatic like some massive ocean basin, but it connects the South China Sea to the Western Pacific. And that connection is everything. This narrow waterway functions like a valve in the Indo-Pacific system. Commercial ships move through it. Naval vessels move through it. Submarines slip beneath it. Energy shipments pass quietly in the night. Roughly 1/3 of global maritime trade flows through the broader South China Sea region, valued somewhere between $3 to $5 trillion annually. That's not abstract economics. That's supply chains, oil tankers, food imports, semiconductor shipments, the invisible arteries of modern life. Whoever influences this corridor influences movement. And in geopolitics, movement is power. In peacetime, it's a shipping route. In a crisis, it becomes a choke point. Militaries understand this instinctively. Control the strait, or at least monitor it closely, and you gain leverage over both the South China Sea and access to the open Pacific. That's not a theory. That's geography doing what geography has always done, shaping strategy whether states like it or not. Now zoom in further. The northernmost islands of the Philippines, especially Batanes, sit roughly 120 to 200 kilometers from Taiwan. That distance is so small, it almost feels uncomfortable when you think about it in military terms. In a Taiwan contingency, that gap is not a buffer. It's a bridge. I sometimes feel people underestimate how physical this reality is. We talk about regional stability in abstract language, but the map is brutally clear. If tensions escalate across the Taiwan Strait, Philippine territory could suddenly matter in ways that go far beyond diplomacy. Logistics hubs, surveillance points, air and naval staging areas, even humanitarian evacuation corridors. Geography does not wait for political neutrality. And this isn't speculation pulled from thin air. The expansion of U.S. access to Philippine bases under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement has already highlighted this shift. Several of the newly accessible sites are in northern Luzon. That decision was not random. It reflects a recognition that the Luzon Strait sits at the intersection of two security theaters, the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. When defense planners look at northern Luzon, they don't just see provincial towns and coastlines. They see range arcs, air corridors, sea lanes, early warning possibilities. That's why potential military coordination between Manila and Taipei feels so consequential. It doesn't just add another diplomatic layer, it activates geography. And geography, unlike politics, doesn't compromise. There are disputes in Asia that are complicated. And then there is Taiwan. For Beijing, Taiwan is not just another territorial disagreement. It is tied to history, legitimacy, national identity, the unfinished chapter of civil war and reunification. When Chinese officials talk about it, the tone changes. It becomes sharper, less flexible, almost existential.
中国海军舰艇编队在公海的有关行动。
The government of the People's Republic of China considers Taiwan a core sovereignty issue and a non-negotiable national interest. Under what Beijing calls the One China principle, Taiwan is viewed as part of China's territory, and any form of foreign military engagement with Taipei is framed as interference in internal affairs. This is not rhetorical window dressing. It is a red line that has been repeated across administrations and decades. Chinese leadership has often used a stark warning when addressing foreign involvement in Taiwan-related matters. Those who play with fire will perish by it. It's dramatic, it's blunt, and it's designed to leave no ambiguity about the stakes as Beijing sees them. From Beijing's perspective, military coordination between the Philippines and Taiwan would not be interpreted as routine security dialogue. It would be read through a sovereignty lens. And once something is categorized as a sovereignty issue in Chinese strategic thinking, the tolerance threshold narrows dramatically. If we look at past behavior, China has shown a willingness to respond economically and diplomatically when it believes the One China policy is being challenged. Take Lithuania. After Vilnius allowed Taiwan to open a representative office using the name Taiwan rather than Taipei, Beijing responded with trade restrictions and diplomatic downgrades. The message was clear. Symbolic gestures can carry material consequences. Or consider South Korea during the deployment of the US THAAD missile defense system. Beijing opposed the system, arguing it threatened Chinese security interests. What followed was a period of informal economic retaliation, restrictions on tourism, pressure on Korean businesses operating in China, and broader commercial strain. These cases are different from Taiwan itself, but they reveal a pattern. When Beijing perceives encroachment on core interests, it does not limit its response to diplomatic statements. It uses leverage. That's why any visible military alignment between Manila and Taipei would almost certainly trigger a strong reaction. Not necessarily immediate escalation, but pressure. Economic signals. Political messaging. Possibly maritime assertiveness. For China, Taiwan is not one issue among many. It is the issue that reshapes all the others. If you sit in Manila and look west, you see Chinese vessels. If you look north, you see Taiwan. And if you look east, you see the United States. That's not just geography, that's pressure. The Philippines has been facing increasing maritime friction in the South China Sea for years now. Chinese Coast Guard ships have operated within 50 nautical miles of Philippine-claimed features. There have been water cannon incidents, dangerous maneuvers, even ramming episodes that felt less like accidents and more like signaling. At some point, repeated gray zone actions stop feeling gray. They start feeling deliberate. From Manila's perspective, this isn't about provoking anyone. It's about preventing further erosion of its position. Philippine defense officials have framed enhanced security cooperation, whether with the United States or potentially others, as necessary to strengthen maritime domain awareness and regional stability. That language matters. It signals deterrence, not aggression. And honestly, deterrence logic is simple. If pressure increases, you reinforce. You build partnerships. You complicate an adversary's calculations. Small states have always done this. History is full of it. At the core of Manila's security architecture sits the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States. It's old, Cold War era, but still very alive. American officials have repeatedly clarified that an armed attack on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the South China Sea would trigger Mutual Defense Treaty obligations. That reassurance is not symbolic. It's operational. In recent years, the Philippines and the U.S. have conducted over 500 joint military activities, exercises, patrols, training rotations. That's not a casual partnership. That's integration. The expansion of base access under EDCA in northern Luzon adds another layer. It quietly connects South China Sea contingencies with Taiwan-related scenarios, whether anyone openly says it or not. So when Manila explores deeper coordination near the Luzon Strait, it's not operating in isolation. It's acting within an alliance framework that has been tightening, not loosening. Here's where it gets complicated. The Philippines formally adheres to the One China policy. Officially, it recognizes Beijing, not Taipei. That position hasn't changed, but exploratory military coordination with Taiwan, even limited or contingency-based, introduces dual signaling. To Washington, it reassures Manila is aligned, proactive, prepared. To Beijing, it risks looking like quiet alignment with a containment strategy. That's the tightrope. Manila likely believes it can maintain balance, deter without provoking, prepare without escalating. But ambiguity cuts both ways. It creates flexibility, yes. It also creates suspicion. And in an environment already thick with mistrust, even subtle shifts can feel seismic. For the Philippines, this isn't about choosing sides in theory. It's about surviving in a neighborhood where the stakes keep rising, and where doing nothing carries its own risks. The danger isn't always in the big dramatic moves. Sometimes it's in the ripple effects. If Manila deepens coordination with Taiwan, Beijing may not respond in the Taiwan Strait first. It could respond where it already has leverage, the South China Sea. That means intensified maritime pressure around contested features like Second Thomas Shoal, more Coast Guard patrols, more aggressive shadowing, possibly tighter blockades of resupply missions. We've already seen water cannons and near collisions. It doesn't take much imagination to see how that pattern could escalate. The logic would be simple: signal costs without crossing into open conflict. China wouldn't need to declare retaliation. Increased presence alone would shift the operational environment. The Philippines would feel it immediately. Every resupply run would become heavier. Every maneuver is riskier. And with more vessels operating in tight proximity, the chance of miscalculation rises. History shows that escalation rarely starts with missiles. It starts with friction. Now imagine a cross-strait crisis. Even if Manila insists it is not a party to the dispute, geography complicates neutrality. Northern Luzon sits close enough to Taiwan that its airfields and ports become strategically relevant whether the Philippines intends it or not. If U.S. forces utilize facilities under existing agreements, those sites could be perceived as forward operating platforms in a U.S.-China confrontation. That's where the concept of entrapment enters the conversation. Security scholars often warn that middle powers located near flashpoints face entrapment risks when aligning too closely with great power strategies. The fear is not abandonment. It is being pulled into a conflict whose timing and intensity are determined elsewhere. The Philippines could wake up one day to find that its territory, though sovereign, has become a critical node in someone else's war plan. And that's a sobering thought. Within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, caution is practically doctrine. ASEAN has historically avoided formal positioning on Taiwan sovereignty. The emphasis has always been dialogue, non-interference, and maintaining regional stability. That approach may frustrate external powers, but it has helped preserve a delicate balance in a diverse region. The Philippines, as an ASEAN member, has traditionally operated within that framework. Even when tensions in the South China Sea flare, Manila's language often returns to multilateralism and legal process. Overt military cooperation with Taiwan could complicate that posture. Other Southeast Asian states might worry that Manila is stepping beyond ASEAN informal consensus on avoiding entanglement in cross-strait politics. The risk isn't formal expulsion or open criticism. It's quieter than that. Subtle diplomatic distance. Reduced cohesion. A perception that the Philippines is aligning more clearly with bloc politics rather than maintaining regional neutrality. And in Southeast Asia, perception shapes diplomacy more than public statements ever admit. There are two ways to read Manila's potential shift. The first interpretation is strategic prudence. Geographic proximity makes preparedness unavoidable. Ignoring the Taiwan dimension would be strategically naive. Limited coordination enhances deterrence and reduces the risk of miscalculation. It signals resolve against coercive pressure in the South China Sea and communicates that Manila will not be strategically isolated. From this perspective, doing nothing would be the greater risk. The second interpretation is strategic overreach. It provokes China unnecessarily. It increases economic exposure. It risks transforming the Philippines into a frontline state in a superpower confrontation that it cannot control. From this angle, restraint is strength. Both interpretations contain truth. That's what makes the debate so intense. Manila now faces difficult questions that cannot be answered with slogans. Can it maintain formal adherence to the One China policy while expanding practical military coordination in ways that Beijing will inevitably scrutinize? Does enhanced deterrence genuinely outweigh the risks of economic retaliation or maritime escalation? Is the Philippines reinforcing its sovereignty or inadvertently increasing its strategic vulnerability by tying its security posture more closely to a great power rivalry? These are not abstract policy seminar questions. They are choices with material consequences. The Philippines' movement toward military cooperation with Taiwan represents a consequential recalibration of foreign policy. It emerges from real security pressures in the South China Sea. It reflects alliance dynamics that have been strengthening for years. And it is rooted in geography that cannot be changed. Yet it also intersects directly with China's most sensitive red line. The outcome will not depend solely on intent. It will depend on calibration, how carefully Manila balances sovereignty, alliance commitments, economic exposure, and regional diplomacy. The margin for miscalculation is thin. The region is already tense. In one of the world's most combustible geopolitical theaters, even incremental shifts can carry strategic weight far beyond their immediate appearance. And that is why this moment matters. The most important thing happening in the Bashi Channel right now is not the Coast Guard ships. It is not the patrols. It is not even the exercises. The most important thing is what all of it represents. For decades, Beijing assumed that the narrow stretch of water between Taiwan and the Philippines would stay politically divided. Two countries, two separate problems, no coordination, no connection. That assumption is quietly falling apart, and that is why China is paying very close attention to this channel right now. Pull up a map of East Asia. Look at the space between the southern tip of Taiwan and the northern tip of the Philippines. That narrow strip of ocean is the Bashi Channel. It is roughly 250 kilometers wide. It connects the South China Sea to the Philippine Sea and the broader Pacific Ocean. And it sits at the heart of one of the most contested regions on the planet. Now here is the key question. Why does this particular stretch of water matter so much? The answer comes down to geography. Most maps make the Pacific look open and free. But for China's Navy, it is not. China's coastline opens onto enclosed, shallow seas. To reach the deeper Pacific Ocean, Chinese ships and submarines must pass through a limited number of gateways. These gateways are called choke points. The Bashi Channel is one of the most important choke points in the world. The Luzon Strait, which includes the Bashi Channel, drops to depths exceeding 5,000 meters in places. That depth is critical. It gives submarines room to operate quietly, without being easily detected from above. This is why Chinese nuclear submarines, carrier groups, surveillance ships, and surface vessels have all transited this channel repeatedly over the years. If you control what happens in the Bashi Channel, you have a major say in what China's Navy can and cannot do in the Pacific. To understand why the Bashi Channel makes Beijing nervous, you need to understand the first island chain. The first island chain is a line of islands stretching from Japan in the north, down through Taiwan, the Philippines, and towards Southeast Asia. It was a concept developed by American strategists during the Cold War. The idea was simple. These islands form a natural barrier, a wall of geography that separates China's coastal seas from the open Pacific. From China's perspective, this wall is a problem. A navy that cannot freely cross the first island chain cannot fully project power. It cannot protect its trade routes. It cannot threaten distant targets. It cannot deter an adversary coming from the east. This is why China has been working so hard to build a true blue water navy, one that can operate far beyond its own coastline. And to do that, China's ships must pass through the choke points in that island chain. The Bashi Channel is one of those choke points. In fact, analysts at the Royal United Services Institute in London have noted that Chinese submarines can only leave the first island chain through passages like the Bashi Channel, because most other routes are too shallow for safe submarine operations. China's constrained geography, which means that submarines can only leave the first island chain through choke points like the Bashi Channel, further limits Chinese submarine operations. Royal United Services Institute 2025 China has been responding to this problem by pushing harder. The PLAN, which stands for People's Liberation Army Navy, has grown into the world's largest navy by number of vessels, with over 370 ships compared to roughly 290 in the US Navy. Carrier strike groups built around the Liaoning, Shandong, and the newer Fujian carrier have begun operating beyond the first island chain with increasing regularity. But bigger does not mean freer. Every time a Chinese carrier group transits toward the Pacific, it passes through a corridor that others are watching. And lately, more and more eyes are watching the Bashi Channel. In late 2024 and into 2025, something unusual happened. Philippine and Taiwanese Coast Guard vessels began patrolling together in the Bashi Channel. Not a formal alliance, not a military treaty, just practical cooperation between two Coast Guard forces operating in overlapping waters. But the symbolism went far beyond the patrol itself. Taiwan exists in one of the most unusual political situations in the world. China insists Taiwan is a Chinese province. Because of this, most countries cannot officially recognize Taiwan or sign formal military agreements with it. Taiwan operates in a kind of diplomatic gray zone, where everything real must be done quietly. So when the Philippines began patrolling alongside Taiwan's Coast Guard, it was not just a maritime event, it was a political signal. Manila was saying, without saying it out loud, that it is willing to treat Taiwan as a practical partner. To be clear about what this is and is not, this is not a military alliance. There is no defense pact. There is no joint command. But there is growing operational familiarity. And in geopolitics, operational familiarity is the foundation from which alliances are eventually built. It went further. Taiwan also sent Navy and Marine Corps personnel to observe the 2025 Commandant Joint Exercise led by U.S. and Philippine Marines. Taiwanese officers participated in tabletop planning sessions. According to officials and advisors cited by the Washington Post, Filipino academics attended closed-door forums with top Taiwanese generals in early 2025. Our security and military cooperation with the Philippines is going to get closer and closer. Taiwanese government advisor Washington Post, 2025 and February 2026, the Philippines, United States, and Japan conducted joint aerial exercises directly over the Bashi Channel. It was the first time that multinational military exercises of this kind had expanded beyond the South China Sea into this corridor. China's People's Liberation Army Southern Theater Command reacted angrily, accusing the Philippines of disrupting regional peace. None of this happened by accident. The Philippines under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has made a deliberate choice to build a wider network of security partnerships. The reason is simple. The Philippines has been under sustained maritime pressure from China for years. Around Second Thomas Shoal and in the West Philippine Sea, Philippine supply missions have been hit with water cannons. Filipino sailors have been injured. Coast Guard vessels have been surrounded and harassed. The confrontations have become more frequent and more aggressive. Manila concluded that a single security relationship, even a strong one with the United States, was not enough. The Philippines needed depth. It needed multiple partnerships that could reinforce each other. The results have come quickly. U.S.-Philippines joint activities now number over 500 planned for 2026 under what has been called the 8-Star Plan, approved by U.S. Indo-Pacific Command and the Armed Forces of the Philippines in August 2025. The Balikatan 2026 exercise has been described as the largest combat exercise staged in Southeast Asia. Japan and the Philippines signed new defense agreements in 2025. Australia has participated in amphibious exercises in the West Philippine Sea. South Korea has supplied ships. France, Japan, and Australia are providing nearly 50 patrol boats to the Philippine Coast Guard over the coming decade. And sitting at the center of all of it is Batanes. Batanes is a small group of islands at the northern tip of the Philippines. For most of Philippine history, it was a remote, quiet province known for its unique culture and dramatic landscapes. Strategically, it barely registered. Today, it is one of the most strategically significant pieces of land in Southeast Asia. Batanes sits directly in the Luzon Strait, roughly 193 kilometers from the southern coast of Taiwan. It controls the approaches to the Bashi Channel from the south. Any ship or aircraft passing between the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea goes through this zone. In August 2025, the Philippines opened the Mahatao Forward Operating Base on Batan Island, the main island of Batanes. It is described as the largest armed forces of the Philippines infrastructure in the region. The United States deployed the Navy Marine Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, known as MESIS, to Batanes. These are anti-ship missile systems. It was the first time anti-ship missiles had been deployed to the Luzon Strait. They were placed less than 200 kilometers from Taiwan. Philippine Defense Secretary Teodoro has called Batanes the country's spearhead. President Marcos himself has warned that a conflict over Taiwan would drag the Philippines in, whether it wanted to be or not. With nearly 200,000 Filipinos living in Taiwan, the country has a direct personal stake in what happens there. Rear Admiral Trinidad said it plainly in an earlier briefing. By divine design, we have been put here. Rear Admiral Roy Vincent Trinidad, Philippine Navy, the phrase is casual. The meaning is not. China does not face one powerful adversary in the Bashi Channel. What it faces is something potentially harder to deal with: a network. Think about what has assembled around this corridor in just the past 2 years. The United States and the Philippines have formalized over 500 joint military activities for 2026. Japan has signed new defense agreements with Manila and deployed forces in Balikatan exercises. Australia has joined amphibious exercises in Philippine waters. Taiwan has participated in tabletop exercises with Philippine and American officers. Anti-ship missiles have been deployed to Batans for the first time. Philippine and Taiwanese Coast Guards have conducted joint patrols in the Bashi Channel itself. No single partnership changes everything, but the combination of partnerships creates something larger. It creates overlapping zones of coverage. Information sharing. Mutual familiarity. A shared interest in monitoring what moves through that channel. This is what strategists call the network effect. Each connection strengthens every other connection. And the network around the Bashi Channel has been growing faster than Beijing expected. Taiwan has invested heavily in its own Coast Guard capability as well. Under a $3.3 billion program launched by the previous Tsai Ing-wen administration, Taiwan is equipping its Coast Guard with over 100 patrol vessels by 2027. The newest class, the Anping class, carries anti-ship missiles. Taiwan's latest high-latitude patrol vessels, the Soraya class, are built with a range exceeding 10,000 nautical miles, specifically suited for operations in the Bashi Channel and the Pacific. China is now caught in a classic strategic problem. When a country sees its neighbors strengthening their security ties, it has two basic choices. It can ignore it and hope the trend reverses. Or it can push back, using pressure and confrontation to send a message. Beijing has largely chosen the second path. China's Coast Guard vessels have been seen operating in the Bashi Channel. China's military exercises, including the December 2025 Justice Mission 2025 drill ordered by Xi Jinping, have included operations in the Luzon Strait. The PLA Southern Theater Command has issued strong statements criticizing every joint exercise and patrol that takes place in the channel. But here is the problem with that approach. Every time China increases pressure, its neighbors respond by strengthening their own ties. Japan increases its cooperation with the Philippines. The Philippines deepens its relationship with Taiwan. Taiwan accelerates its Coast Guard buildup. Australia joins more exercises. The network grows tighter. This is the security dilemma in its clearest form. The more aggressively China acts to protect its access to the Bashi Channel, the more it motivates others to monitor and complicate that access. War over Taiwan will drag the Philippines kicking and screaming into the conflict. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Philippines, 2024 Marcos made that statement not as a threat, but as a warning. The Philippines did not go looking for a conflict with China. It found itself at the center of one because of its geography. And it has responded by making sure it is not alone. Let us come back to where we started. A handful of Coast Guard vessels patrolling a stretch of ocean does not change the balance of power. That is true. A forward operating base on a small island does not win a war. That is also true. A joint aerial exercise over the Bashi Channel does not rewrite the rules of the region. Still true. But taken together, these events tell a different story. The political geography around the Bashi Channel is changing. The Philippines and Taiwan are becoming more connected. The Philippines is becoming more integrated with Japan, Australia, and the United States. One of China's most critical maritime gateways, the passage its navy must use to reach the Pacific, is increasingly watched by countries that share deep concerns about Beijing's growing power. The Coast Guard patrols are simply the most visible sign of that change. The real shift is happening underneath. In tabletop exercises, in closed-door forums, in defense agreements and patrol vessel deliveries and base inaugurations on remote islands. China built its naval expansion strategy on the assumption that the first island chain was fragmented and manageable. That assumption is being tested in real time. The Bashi Channel has always been important. What is new is that so many people are now paying attention to it.
A delegation of Taiwanese Coast Guard members is in the Philippines as the two countries face increasing aggression from China.
In a rare visit, a Philippine delegation has traveled to Taiwan for a maritime forum.
What looked like a low-key technical meeting in Manila between the Philippine Coast Guard and Taiwan's Coast Guard administration was, in reality, a quiet signal of how frontline states are adapting to a rapidly hardening maritime environment across East Asia. The discussions, focused on intelligence sharing, training, and capacity building, were deliberately framed as non-political, yet they unfolded against a backdrop of unprecedented Chinese pressure in both the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. In the weeks surrounding the meeting, Chinese Coast Guard vessels intensified harassment of Philippine resupply missions near Ayungin Shoal, using water cannons and close-quarter maneuvering, while the PLA simultaneously conducted large-scale joint air-sea drills around Taiwan, repeatedly crossing the median line and rehearsing blockade scenarios. The simultaneity is not incidental. It reflects a single, integrated pressure strategy that treats Manila and Taipei not as separate theaters, but as linked nodes along the first island chain. This is precisely why the PCG-CGA engagement matters. Rather than responding with overt naval coordination, which would invite escalation and diplomatic backlash, the Philippines and Taiwan are aligning at the level where China is actually applying force. Coast guards, law enforcement authorities, and administrative control at sea. Beijing's gray zone playbook relies on the normalization of coercion through routine patrols, maritime militia swarms, and legal narratives that blur the line between peace and conflict. By strengthening Coast Guard cooperation, Manila and Taipei are matching form with form, countering pressure without crossing thresholds that could justify military retaliation.
This is not alliance building in the traditional sense. It is operational alignment designed to deny China uncontested control of the maritime gray zone.
The approach mirrors a broader regional shift. Japan has doubled down on Coast Guard coordination with the Philippines and Vietnam, recognizing that most confrontations now involve white-hulled ships rather than destroyers. Indonesia and Australia emphasize joint patrols and maritime domain awareness to maintain presence without provocation. Even smaller states are prioritizing legal enforcement, surveillance integration, and information sharing over headline-grabbing naval deployments. What sets the Philippines-Taiwan Channel apart is its strategic geography. Together, they anchor the southern and central arcs of the first island chain, meaning coordination between them directly complicates China's ability to compartmentalize pressure and isolate targets.
This quiet Manila meeting signals a transition from isolated national responses toward a loosely networked maritime deterrence architecture, one that relies on coast guards as the first line of resistance, information as the decisive currency, and legitimacy as a strategic weapon. It does not announce itself with treaties or task forces, but it reshapes the operational environment all the same. In an era where control is asserted not through battle, but through repetition, presence, and administrative pressure, these understated linkages may prove more consequential than any single naval deployment. The strategic backdrop to the Philippines, Taiwan Coast Guard engagement, is defined by the convergence of two maritime flashpoints that are increasingly operating as a single, connected battle space, rather than isolated crises. In the South China Sea, the Philippines has faced an unprecedented surge in Chinese coercive activity over 2024 to 2025, with Manila documenting well over 100 harassment incidents involving the China Coast Guard and maritime militia. These encounters have included high-pressure water cannon attacks against Philippine resupply missions, deliberate ramming maneuvers, close-in shadowing designed to force course changes, and the use of military-grade lasers to temporarily blind bridge crews. What makes this pressure structurally dangerous is not just its frequency, but its institutional backing. China now fields the world's largest Coast Guard, with more than 150 large patrol vessels, many displacing over 10,000 tons, larger than most Southeast Asian naval frigates, and increasingly armed, hardened, and integrated into joint operations with the PLA Navy and maritime militia forces. At the same time, the Taiwan Strait has entered a phase of near constant operational stress. Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense reports almost daily PLA Navy,
PLA Air Force, and China Coast Guard activity in and around the strait, often involving coordinated multi-ship and multi-domain formations. Median line crossings, once rare and politically sensitive, have become routine. Critically, China has begun relying more heavily on Coast Guard vessels to assert presence and jurisdictional claims, allowing Beijing to normalize operations that would otherwise appear escalatory if conducted solely by naval combatants.
This shift mirrors tactics seen in the West Philippine Sea, where law enforcement framing is used to recast coercion as administration. The key insight is that these pressures are not occurring in parallel by coincidence. They represent two pressure points within a single Chinese maritime strategy aimed at reshaping control along the first island chain without triggering outright conflict. By applying sustained, calibrated pressure through coast guards rather than navies, Beijing seeks to exhaust opponents politically, operationally, and psychologically, forcing them to choose between acquiescence or escalation. From this perspective, the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait are operationally linked. Success in normalizing dominance in one theater reinforces legitimacy claims and tactical confidence in the other. It is this recognition that resistance must also be connected and coordinated that explains why Manila and Taipei are quietly aligning their Coast Guard responses. In a gray zone contest defined by presence, repetition, and legality, fragmentation favors the pressure applier. Coordination favors the defender. The Luzon Strait is the geographic hinge that makes separation between the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait increasingly artificial. And it is precisely this geography that compels closer cooperation between the Philippines and Taiwan, regardless of political sensitivities. Sitting between northern Luzon and southern Taiwan, the strait forms the primary maritime corridor linking the South China Sea to the Philippine Sea and the wider Western Pacific. For the PLA Navy, it is one of the most critical breakout routes for submarines and surface combatants seeking to evade containment inside the first island chain and operate freely in the open Pacific. For the United States and its allies, the same waters are indispensable for naval maneuver, reinforcement flows, and sustained operations across multiple theaters.
Layered on top of this military reality is the strait's economic and digital importance, carrying major global shipping lanes and hosting dense networks of undersea communication cables that underpin regional trade, finance, and connectivity. This strategic value translates into an unavoidable operational reality for Manila. Any contingency involving Taiwan, whether a blockade, large-scale exercises, or outright conflict, would immediately spill into northern Philippine waters. PLA naval and Coast Guard movements transiting the Luzon Strait would place pressure on Philippine maritime domain awareness, airspace management, and coastal security, while U.S. and allied forces maneuvering in response would do the same. The Philippines would not need to take sides actively to feel the effects. Geography alone ensures exposure.
Conversely, escalation in the South China Sea increasingly carries risks of cross-theater spillover into the Taiwan Strait, as Chinese forces operate with growing confidence and integration across both zones, blurring once distinct operational boundaries. This is why Coast Guard coordination between the Philippines and Taiwan is not merely optional or symbolic, but structurally necessary. Both sides monitor overlapping waters, face the same law enforcement-driven pressure tactics, and confront the same challenge of maintaining sovereignty and safety without triggering escalation. The Luzon Strait removes the luxury of strategic compartmentalization. It binds Manila and Taipei into a shared security environment where awareness, communication, and coordination become prerequisites for stability rather than political statements. In this sense, cooperation is not about alignment. It is about managing a reality imposed by maps, sea lanes, and the immutable logic of maritime geography. Beneath the deliberately restrained public framing, the Manila talks between the Philippine Coast Guard and Taiwan's Coast Guard administration focused on practical cooperation areas that directly address the mechanics of gray zone pressure at sea. At the core of the discussions was intelligence and information sharing, particularly in the realm of maritime domain awareness. Both sides face the same operational challenge: identifying, tracking, and interpreting the behavior of Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels that operate aggressively yet remain just below the threshold of open conflict. Vessel tracking, pattern of life analysis, and the early identification of anomalous or coercive behavior are essential to countering tactics designed to appear routine
while gradually shifting control. Improving early warning of gray zone activities allows Coast Guards to respond faster, document incidents more effectively, and reduce the risk of tactical surprise.
Capacity building formed the second pillar of the talks, reflecting a shared understanding that deterrence in contested waters is as much about professionalism and readiness as it is about hull numbers. Training exchanges were discussed to improve boarding procedures, command and control practices, and coordination under stress, while search and rescue cooperation addressed a politically neutral yet operationally vital mission that often intersects with confrontations at sea. Law enforcement best practices in disputed or sensitive waters were also a key focus, particularly how to uphold safety, evidence collection, and legal credibility while operating under persistent harassment. In gray zone contests, legitimacy is a force multiplier, and Coast Guards that act consistently, transparently, and within recognized norms are better positioned to counter coercion without escalation. The talks also addressed operational coordination, especially the need for reliable crisis communication channels and incident response protocols near shared sea lanes. Miscalculation remains one of the greatest risks in congested maritime environments like the Luzon Strait and adjacent waters. Clear lines of communication, agreed procedures for close encounters, and shared expectations for de-escalation are essential to preventing localized incidents from spiraling into broader crises. These mechanisms are not about conducting joint operations in public view, but about ensuring predictability and control when pressure intensifies. Equally important is what the Manila talks did not include. There was no public announcement of joint patrols, no alliance language, and no formal security pact. This strategic ambiguity is not a weakness, it is intentional design.
The approach closely mirrors existing Coast Guard cooperation models between Japan and the Philippines, as well as Vietnam and the Philippines, where capability development and quiet coordination precede any overt signaling. By prioritizing substance over symbolism, Manila and Taipei are building operational resilience first, while leaving strategic messaging flexible. The logic is clear. Strengthen capacity now, normalize coordination quietly, and preserve the option to signal more openly later if circumstances demand it. In a gray zone environment where escalation is often triggered by perception rather than intent, silence, when paired with capability, can be a strategic asset.
From Beijing's vantage point, the significance of Coast Guard cooperation between the Philippines and Taiwan lies less in its immediate tactical impact and more in the strategic costs it introduces over time. China's gray zone strategy depends heavily on informational asymmetry and selective pressure, applying force incrementally in fragmented theaters and against individual targets that can be isolated politically and operationally. Quiet coordination between Manila and Taipei directly complicates this approach. Expanded surveillance and information sharing across the Luzon Strait and adjacent waters increase the likelihood that Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia movements are tracked, documented, and contextualized as part of a broader pattern rather than dismissed as isolated incidents. This raises the risk that coercive actions intended to appear routine are instead exposed as deliberate and coordinated pressure.
More importantly, cooperation reduces China's ability to compartmentalize its targets. Beijing has long managed maritime disputes by keeping them bilateral, pressuring the Philippines in the South China Sea, Taiwan in the Strait, Japan near the Senkakus, while insisting that each issue is unrelated to the others. When frontline actors begin sharing awareness and aligning responses, that fragmentation erodes. Chinese actions in one theater can no longer be confidently assumed to remain politically contained there. Pressure applied near Ayungin Shoal increasingly resonates in Taipei, just as operations around Taiwan attract scrutiny in Manila. This interconnection raises both political and operational costs, forcing Beijing to account for cross-theater consequences that its gray zone tactics are designed to avoid.
There is also a narrative dimension that Beijing cannot ignore. China consistently frames maritime disputes as narrow, bilateral issues rooted in historical claims and domestic law enforcement. Coast Guard cooperation among frontline states subtly undermines this narrative by reinforcing the perception that what is occurring is not a collection of separate disagreements, but a shared regional challenge requiring collective responses. Crucially, this cooperation does not resemble formal containment. There are no alliances announced, no joint patrols publicized, and no overt military signaling.
Instead, the optics point to regional pushback driven by necessity and geography rather than ideology or bloc politics. That distinction matters because it makes it harder for Beijing to rally diplomatic support by portraying itself as the victim of external encirclement.
The implications of the Manila talks extend well beyond bilateral Philippines-Taiwan cooperation, pointing instead to a gradual integration of security practices along the first island chain. The PCG-CGA engagement complements an already expanding lattice of informal coordination that includes U.S.-Philippines joint maritime patrols, Japan-Philippines Coast Guard exercises, and Australia's steadily increased maritime presence in Southeast Asian waters. What binds these efforts together is not a treaty framework, but a shared operational logic, maintaining presence, awareness, and legal legitimacy in contested seas without formal alliance commitments. This trend reflects a broader shift in Indo-Pacific security toward functional networking, states cooperating where interests overlap, quietly aligning capabilities while avoiding the political costs and escalation risks associated with explicit military blocs. For Southeast Asia, this model carries important signaling effects. It demonstrates that cooperation need not require choosing sides between major powers, nor does it demand overt alignment with US-led containment narratives. Instead, it reinforces maritime law enforcement as a stabilizing mechanism, one that prioritizes safety, rules, and continuity over confrontation. By keeping cooperation at the Coast Guard level, regional states preserve diplomatic flexibility while still strengthening their ability to resist coercion. This is particularly important for ASEAN members, many of whom face similar pressures but remain wary of moves that could fracture regional unity or provoke retaliation. At the same time, the constraints and risks surrounding this cooperation are real and persistent. Politically, Manila must balance closer coordination with Taiwan against its long-standing emphasis on ASEAN cohesion and strategic ambiguity. Any perception that the Philippines is drifting toward explicit cross-strait alignment could complicate relations with neighbors that prefer neutrality. For Taiwan, diplomatic isolation imposes hard limits on how formal or visible such cooperation can become, forcing reliance on unofficial or technical channels that lack institutional depth. These sensitivities mean progress will likely remain incremental rather than declaratory. Operational risks are equally significant. Gray zone environments are inherently unstable, and closer coordination does not eliminate the danger of miscalculation during close encounters at sea. As information sharing increases, so does the risk of Chinese lawfare responses, legal, regulatory, or administrative actions designed to delegitimize cooperation or impose costs without direct confrontation. There are also internal concerns about information security, particularly when intelligence sharing involves sensitive tracking data or operational patterns that could be exploited if compromised. Managing these risks will require discipline, trust, and robust safeguards, not just goodwill. Looking ahead, the trajectory from dialogue to tangible impact is likely to follow a phased path. In the short term, progress will center on technical exchanges, professional training, and quiet intelligence coordination focused on maritime domain awareness and early warning. These steps are deliberately low visibility but high utility, laying the groundwork for trust and interoperability. Over the medium term, cooperation could expand into joint training activities and more coordinated responses to incidents near shared sea lanes, particularly around the Luzon Strait, where spillover risks are highest. Over the long term, PCG-CGA coordination may be absorbed into a broader Indo-Pacific maritime security network, one that links coast guards, law enforcement agencies, and civilian maritime authorities across the region without formal alliance structures. The Manila talks illustrate how deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is evolving. This was not a headline-seeking move, nor an attempt to redraw strategic lines overnight. It was a pragmatic adaptation to sustained pressure, one that reflects how smaller and middle maritime states are learning to share burdens, increase resilience, and preserve stability without escalating conflict. The deeper lesson is that deterrence today is no longer defined solely by firepower or visibility. It is increasingly distributed across networks, built through coordination rather than confrontation, and led as much by civilian maritime institutions as by navies. In this environment, quiet cooperation is not a weakness, it is the strategy. If you like the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.
Tensions between Tokyo and Beijing continue to simmer after Chinese military jets reportedly locked onto Japanese fighters near Okinawa.
A senior official from Japan's foreign ministry is in China to calm the diplomatic row between the two countries that has been brewing for weeks. It was sparked by the Japanese Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, when she said a Chinese attack on Taiwan could threaten Japanese survival.
Japan could deploy its self-defense forces if China invades Taiwan. That's according to Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae.
When Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi declared that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be an emergency for Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea and Japan will support the United States in the defense of Taiwan, she did more than restate a policy position. She crystallized a new strategic era in East Asia. Her statement cuts through decades of ambiguity and signals a historic shift. A Taiwan conflict would not be a local crisis. It would instantly engulf the region's major democracies. Takaichi's words carry weight because of who she is and the moment in which she speaks. Becoming Japan's prime minister in October 2025, she is known for a clear-eyed, hawkish approach to China and unwavering support for Taiwan's security. Building on Shinzo Abe's famous line, "A Taiwan emergency is a Japan emergency," she has taken the doctrine further, openly committing Japan to stand alongside the United States in a Taiwan contingency. Few Japanese leaders have spoken with such strategic clarity, and even fewer at a time when China is accelerating military pressure across the First Island chain. Beijing's reaction made the significance unmistakable.
全国各族人民传承和弘扬伟大抗战精神，中华民族伟大复兴势不可挡。
Within hours of her comments, China unleashed a wave of diplomatic protests, state media attacks, and economic pressure targeting Japan, including propaganda campaigns invoking Okinawa and narratives portraying Japan as a regional destabilizer.
日方对自身在台湾问题上的立场一再遮遮掩掩、含糊其辞，对将台湾明确归还中国的开罗宣言、波茨坦公告、日本投降书避而不谈，对构成中日关系政治基础的4个政治文件避而不谈，对日本政府坚持一个中国原则的政治承诺避而不谈。
For all the noise, the message behind China's overreaction is simple. Beijing understands that any assault on Taiwan now risks triggering a multi-country emergency, pulling Japan, the US, and potentially other allies into a fast-escalating conflict. Takaichi's doctrine reshapes the strategic equation, and China knows it. The thesis is clear. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan would not stop at Taiwan. Japan would face an existential threat and an alliance-defining moment. The Philippines would be exposed on its northern frontier, with EDCA bases and sea lanes turning into immediate targets. South Korea would confront a dual crisis: Chinese aggression to the south and a potential North Korean provocation fueled by chaos. Takaichi is not issuing a theoretical warning. She is articulating a new security reality that the Indo-Pacific must now confront.
一貫しております。その上で、日中間に懸案と課題があるからこそ。
Since there are issues and challenges between Japan and China, I believe we should reduce them and increase understanding and cooperation. Japan remains open to various forms of dialogue with China. We have not closed any doors.
To understand why Prime Minister Takaichi's warning resonates across the Indo-Pacific, one must first understand Taiwan's unique geostrategic position. Taiwan is not just an island, it is the hinge of the entire First Island chain, the natural defensive wall stretching from Japan's Okinawa Islands down to the northern Philippines. If China were ever to seize Taiwan, it would not simply change the local balance. It would crack open the gateway to the vast Pacific. A PLA-controlled Taiwan allows Chinese naval and air forces to slip between Okinawa and Taiwan into the Philippine Sea, turning a previously contained coastline into a launch pad for blue water power projection. From there, China could extend military pressure deep into the Bashi Channel and Luzon Strait, the Philippines' northern lifelines. While outflanking the sea lanes, South Korea and Japan depend on for energy, food, and trade. Geography alone makes Taiwan the pivot on which regional security turns.
But geography is only part of the equation. Taiwan is also the world's most indispensable technological choke point, the so-called Silicon Shield. More than 60% of the world's semiconductors are made in Taiwan, and over 90% of the most advanced chips vital for AI, advanced weapon systems, satellites, telecom networks, and global finance come from a single island. TSMC, Taiwan's industrial titan, holds more than 90% of global advanced node capacity. If a conflict were to halt operations there, the impact would be immediate and catastrophic. Markets would crash, supply chains would freeze, and global militaries, including those of Japan, the US, and South Korea, would face unprecedented constraints. In this sense, Taiwan is not merely a strategic location. It is the beating technological heart of the modern world. History provides a preview of what is at stake.
During the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, China fired test missiles near Taiwan and conducted large-scale exercises. Even these limited actions were enough to rattle global markets, trigger emergency alliance consultations, and prompt Washington to deploy 2 carrier strike groups to stabilize the situation. And that was in an era before global economies became deeply dependent on Taiwanese chips. A full-scale invasion in the 2020s, with today's interlocked supply chains and semiconductor reliance, would not be a regional disturbance. It would be a global shockwave. This is why leaders from Tokyo to Manila to Seoul increasingly describe a Taiwan conflict as an emergency, not a distant or isolated issue. The stakes are too high, the geography too vital, and the economic consequences too vast for any regional power to remain untouched.
Japan does not view a Taiwan crisis as a distant geopolitical event. It sees it as a direct threat to national survival. The geography alone makes neutrality impossible. Yonaguni Island sits barely 100 kilometers from Taiwan, and the Okinawa archipelago hosts some of the most important U.S. military bases in the Pacific, including Kadena Air Base and Futenma. In any Chinese invasion of Taiwan, Japanese airspace and maritime zones would immediately be pressured. PLA missiles, fighters, and naval vessels would either cross or skirt Japan's air defense identification zones, forcing constant intercepts and heightening the risk of miscalculation. Worse, if China chooses to strike U.S. bases in Japan, a plausible scenario in any Taiwan contingency, Japan's post-2015 security laws would obligate Tokyo to exercise collective self-defense. In other words, geography ensures that Japan is already inside the battle space before a single decision is made in Tokyo. This perception did not begin with Prime Minister Takaichi. It builds on a decade of evolving strategic thought. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe famously declared, "A Taiwan emergency is a Japanese emergency, and therefore an emergency for the Japan-US alliance." But while Abe's line served as a warning, Takaichi has transformed it into doctrine. Her position is not abstract. She has publicly stated that Japan will support the United States militarily if Taiwan is attacked. This transition, from conditional rhetoric to explicit commitment, marks the sharpest articulation of Japan's Taiwan policy in modern history. Under Takaichi, Tokyo is no longer hinting at involvement. It is preparing for it. Japan's growing military capabilities reinforce this shift. Tokyo is on track to reach 2% of GDP in defense spending, which would make it the world's third largest defense budget, surpassing Russia. This investment is not symbolic. Japan is acquiring long-range strike missiles capable of hitting ships and bases far from its shores, expanding integrated air and missile defense systems designed to counter China's rocket force, and conducting joint operational planning with the United States, specifically for a Taiwan scenario. These steps show a nation systematically preparing for a conflict that could redefine the Indo-Pacific balance of power. The stakes became clear during the 2025 China-Japan diplomatic crisis. After Takaichi reiterated her willingness to defend Taiwan, Beijing launched a fierce political backlash. Propaganda campaigns questioning Japanese sovereignty over Okinawa, diplomatic threats, and targeted economic pressure. Rather than isolate Takaichi, the pressure affirmed her point. China itself now assumes Japan will not stay neutral in a Taiwan conflict. When Beijing overreacts, it is a sign that the strategic calculus has fundamentally shifted. Japan has moved from describing a Taiwan contingency as merely serious to recognizing it as existential. Under Takaichi, the era of ambiguity is over. For the Philippines, a Taiwan conflict is not a distant flashpoint. It is a frontline emergency from the very first hour.
The geography makes this unavoidable. Northern Luzon and the Batanes Islands sit directly beneath Taiwan, separated only by the narrow waters of the Bashi Channel and Luzon Strait. Any clash between the PLA, US, and Japan would unfold across these same waters, placing the Philippines inside the battle space by sheer proximity. Philippine airspace and exclusive economic zone would be vulnerable to military overflight, missile trajectories, electronic warfare, and naval maneuvering. Even without a direct attack, Manila would face the immediate risks of blockade spillover, disrupted sea lanes, and militarized activity around its northern maritime approaches.
Geography ensures that a Taiwan contingency instantly becomes a Philippine contingency. This exposure is reinforced by the country's treaty infrastructure, particularly the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. First signed in 2014, EDCA initially expanded U.S. access to 5 sites, but its 2023 expansion to 9 locations, including bases in northern Luzon and Palawan, effectively knitted the Philippines into the operational architecture of a Taiwan defense plan. The build-out is real. Runways are being extended, fuel depots are being added, radars upgraded, and pre-positioned equipment stockpiled. A recent U.S. report and congressional proposal even suggested Taiwan helping fund upgrades to Philippine bases, explicitly for contingencies involving a Taiwan crisis. These developments show that the Philippines is no longer a passive observer. It is becoming one of the primary logistical and operational hubs for U.S. and allied response scenarios. Beyond strategy, the Philippines faces a profound human emergency in the event of a Taiwan war. More than 170,000 Filipinos live and work in Taiwan, forming one of the island's largest migrant communities. The Philippines' 2023 to 2028 national security policy identifies their safety as a top priority in any cross-strait escalation. A conflict would trigger an enormous evacuation and humanitarian challenge, disrupt billions of pesos in remittances, and create immediate domestic pressure on the government to act. This demographic reality turns a Taiwan invasion from a geopolitical concern into a direct social and economic crisis that touches Filipino families nationwide.
Manila's policy evolution reflects this understanding. Recent analyses by the Lowy Institute and local security think tanks emphasize that China's threats to Taiwan and its coercion in the West Philippine Sea are interconnected problems. The Philippines no longer sees these as separate theaters. It views them as 2 fronts shaped by a single strategic actor. This is why Manila has increased joint exercises with the U.S. and Japan, accelerated EDCA construction, and strengthened basing in northern Luzon. Like Prime Minister Takaichi, Philippine policymakers increasingly recognize that Taiwan's fate has a direct and immediate bearing on Philippine security. In practice, and increasingly in doctrine, Manila is aligning with the logic that a Taiwan emergency is inevitably a Philippine emergency too.
South Korea rarely features in public debates about a Taiwan conflict, but Seoul increasingly acknowledges that the island's fate is tied directly to its own national security. Senior South Korean officials have stated openly that stability in the Taiwan Strait has a direct impact on South Korea's national interest, a position reinforced in multiple joint U.S. ROK statements, emphasizing the need to maintain peace in the strait. This is a significant shift for a country traditionally cautious about provoking Beijing. It reflects a deeper strategic realization. A Taiwan crisis would reverberate across the Korean peninsula within hours, not weeks. Seoul now understands that the shockwaves of conflict in the Taiwan Strait would not sweep around Korea. They would hit Korea first. The greatest challenge South Korea faces is what analysts call the dual contingency problem. In a Taiwan war, South Korea's most important role may not be deploying forces toward Taiwan, but deterring North Korea from launching an opportunistic attack while U.S. forces redeploy southward. Multiple studies warn that China and North Korea could coordinate pressure, forcing Washington to divide its military attention between defending Taiwan and stabilizing the Korean peninsula. For Seoul, this scenario is deeply dangerous. A Taiwan conflict could turn North Korea into a second front, even if South Korea itself takes no provocative action. The logic is simple, but brutal. If Taiwan burns, Korea must brace. Economically, South Korea is more exposed than almost any other U.S. ally. As one of the world's leading semiconductor producers, South Korea is intertwined with Taiwan's chip ecosystem, sharing supply chains, manufacturing equipment, and markets. A disruption in Taiwan would reverberate immediately through Korean tech giants like Samsung,
and SK Hynix. Beyond chips, South Korea's energy imports and trade routes pass through the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, making them vulnerable to blockades, missile coverage, or naval militarization. Even a limited conflict would jolt Korean financial markets and threaten its export-driven economy. For a country whose prosperity is built on stable sea lanes and global trade, a Taiwan war is not a peripheral issue. It is a direct economic threat. A Taiwan invasion would destabilize the entire Indo-Pacific, triggering crises that no regional power can avoid. South Korea may not be the loudest voice in cross-strait debates, but it stands on the quiet front line of a conflict that could reshape the peninsula, the alliance structure, and the economic foundations of Northeast Asia. Prime Minister Takaichi's declaration that Japan will support the United States in the defense of Taiwan is not symbolic rhetoric. It is grounded in the legal and operational architecture Japan has spent a decade building. Under Japan's post-2015 security laws, Tokyo can exercise collective self-defense when two conditions are met: an ally is attacked and Japan's survival is threatened. A Chinese strike on U.S. forces operating from Japanese bases during a Taiwan contingency meets both thresholds unambiguously. In such a scenario, the fight would not be happening over there. It would be occurring from Japanese soil, across Japanese airspace, and directly threatening the safety and continuity of the Japanese state. This legal framework turns Takaichi's statement from a political message into a binding strategic trajectory. In practical terms, Japan's support would be decisive. The United States would rely heavily on access to its bases in Okinawa, Kyushu, and mainland Japan for air operations, maritime patrols, refueling, repair, and logistics. Japan would simultaneously provide integrated air and missile defense, shielding both its own population and U.S. forces from PLA ballistic and cruise missile attacks. Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force destroyers would conduct escort missions, anti-submarine warfare patrols, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations throughout the East China Sea and Philippine Sea. Far from sending troops directly into combat over Taiwan, Japan's real contribution would be enabling the U.S. to fight at all, keeping sea lanes open, protecting bases, and ensuring the joint force can operate under fire. These assumptions are not speculative. They are backed by years of U.S. war games and naval analyses. Repeated studies, including those published by the U.S. Naval Institute and major defense think tanks, conclude that a U.S. defense of Taiwan is extremely difficult, if not impossible, without Japanese basing access, logistics depth, and coordinated operations. Japan is the unsinkable aircraft carrier that anchors the northern flank of the first island chain. Takaichi's public endorsement of this role transforms what used to be an unspoken assumption of strategists into declared policy, which explains the ferocity of Beijing's diplomatic backlash. China understands the implication. If it attacks Taiwan, it will not just face Taiwan, it will face a US-Japan operational machine designed to fight as one.
I did not have the opportunity to communicate with Chinese Premier Li Qiang.
Prime Minister Takaichi's argument rests on a simple but unavoidable truth. The security of East Asia is integrated, and the consequences of a Taiwan invasion would ripple instantly across Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea. For Japan, the loss of Taiwan would place the PLA directly on its doorstep, shattering the first island chain and exposing Okinawa and the Ryukyus to unprecedented pressure. For the Philippines, a Taiwan conflict would militarize the Luzon Strait within hours, threatening the country's northern provinces, endangering over 170,000 Filipino workers in Taiwan, and jeopardizing maritime trade routes vital to the Philippine economy. For South Korea, a war in the Taiwan Strait would generate a dangerous dual-front scenario. The risk of North Korean opportunism combined with a massive economic shock to its semiconductor-driven, export-dependent economy. Seen together, the picture is not regional, it is systemic. Takaichi's logic also fits the structure of America's alliance network. U.S. security commitments in Asia are not isolated treaties. They are interlinked pillars of a single deterrence architecture. A failure to uphold commitments in one theater, Taiwan, would undermine credibility in all others. The U.S.-Japan alliance, the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty, and the U.S.-ROK alliance. This is precisely the danger Shinzo Abe warned of when he said that a Taiwan emergency is a Japan emergency, and Takaichi is now extending that warning across the region. If the U.S. falters in defending Taiwan, the strategic foundations of Asia's security order begin to crumble, and every ally knows it. The bottom line is clear. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan is not merely Taipei's problem. It is a joint emergency that would immediately activate Japanese and American responses and inevitably pull in Manila and Seoul.
Takaichi's position codifies what military planners and intelligence analysts have long understood. Taiwan sits at the center of a networked security system, and its fall would trigger cascading crises that no U.S. ally in East Asia could escape. Her statement is not provocative. It is a rare moment of strategic honesty. And the line that captures this new era best, the one you can use to close your video or article, is this. In the 2020s, the question is no longer whether a Taiwan war would be everyone's crisis. It's whether Asian democracies admit it openly and prepare together. Takaichi's statement does exactly that. If you like the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.
China doesn't want to do that. First of all, the United States is the strongest military power in the world by far. It's not even close. We have the best equipment, we have the best of everything, and nobody's going to mess with that. And I don't see that at all with President Xi. I think we're going to get along very well as it pertains to Taiwan. China doesn't want to do that.
台湾当然是一个国家啊。
台湾从来不是一个国家，过去不是，今后更绝无可能。
Have you ever wondered who really shapes the future of the Indo-Pacific? Is it armies? Is it alliances? Or is it the quiet deals happening behind the scenes? The ones that never make the front page? Well, here's a question that would have sounded impossible just a few years ago. Why would Taiwan, an island fighting for its own survival, help fund military bases in the Philippines? Because that is exactly what a U.S. Congressional Commission has just proposed. A move so unusual, so unprecedented, that it signals a deep shift in the region's balance of power. But before we dive into why this matters, consider another country in a similar situation.
These leaders voice concerns we all share.
Think of Israel in the 1970s. Small, surrounded, outnumbered, forced to build security partnerships far beyond its borders because its geography offered no margin for error. Taiwan faces a similar reality today. 130 kilometers from China, every hour matters. Every ally matters. Every base that can support its defense matters. And that brings us right back to the Philippines, a nation sitting at the intersection of the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, the exact geography Robert D. Kaplan once called the fulcrum on which Asian order turns. So what does this new proposal really mean? Why does the United States want Taiwan to help upgrade Philippine bases? And how could this reshape deterrence, geopolitics, and power across the entire Indo-Pacific? Stay with us, because this story isn't just about funding. It's about strategy, survival, and a new regional alignment taking shape right now, in real time. And in the next minutes, we're going to unpack all of it. Clearly, rationally, and with insight from the world's leading geopolitical thinkers.
全国各族人民传承和弘扬伟大抗战精神，中华民族伟大复兴势不可挡。
That Xi has ordered his military to be capable of invading Taiwan by 2027.
The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, USCC, has put forward a strategically significant recommendation. Allow Taiwan to indirectly finance infrastructure upgrades at Philippine bases under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. Instead of Taipei sending money directly to Manila, which would trigger political backlash in both capitals, the proposal uses the existing U.S. Foreign Military Sales, FMS system. Through FMS, Taiwan would request a defense service consisting of construction, engineering, logistics, and base hardening projects in the Philippines, after which Washington would contract U.S. defense firms to build runways, fuel depots, command centers, and hardened shelters at EDCA sites.
First, I'll acknowledge that all of the EDCA sites are sovereign Philippine territory. We have identified a number of projects that benefit the Philippine AFP and allow the United States and the Philippines to operate together effectively.
The mechanism mirrors how other FMS projects support partner militaries, except here, the infrastructure would sit on Philippine soil while serving a strategic purpose for Taiwan. With Taiwan already facing more than $10 billion in delayed FMS deliveries, investing in forward infrastructure for U.S. forces offers an immediate boost to deterrence, even before new weapons arrive. This idea plugs directly into an ongoing surge of U.S. investment across EDCA sites. Since 2022, Washington has committed tens of millions of dollars to warehouses, airfields, barracks, and operations centers at the original EDCA locations, followed in 2024 by an additional $128 million for 7 sites and a separate $500 million military financing package for the Philippines. Recent contracts, such as a $32 million airfield upgrade, demonstrate how these funds translate into usable capability: longer runways, expanded dispersal areas, and more robust storage for fuel and munitions. Analysts note that northern Luzon's EDCA bases are central to U.S. planning for Taiwan contingencies, offering shorter flight distances and redundancy if facilities in Guam or Japan are compromised. In this context, Taiwan's financial participation looks less like foreign aid and more like an investment in the external infrastructure required for its own survival, an off-island network of hardened sites 1,000 kilometers to the south that would be indispensable in any major crisis across the Taiwan Strait.
Graham Allison once warned that when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling one, war often follows. The Indo-Pacific today lives inside that warning. China has increased its official defense budget to roughly 1.78 trillion yuan in 2025, about $245 to $250 billion. Its 10th straight year of growth, with another 7.2% jump over the previous year. At sea, Beijing now fields the world's largest navy by number of ships, with over 370 combat vessels today, and projections of about 395 by 2025 and 435 by 2030, even as the United States struggles to stay above 300. This buildup is not abstract. It is paired with an aggressive gray zone campaign. In the South China Sea, Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia ships have repeatedly rammed, blocked, and blasted water cannons at Philippine vessels, resupplying the grounded BRP Sierra Madre at 2nd Thomas Shoal, even causing serious injuries to Filipino personnel in 2024 and 2025. Each collision, each use of lasers or water cannons reinforces the feeling among regional states that the balance of power is shifting, slowly but relentlessly, in China's favor. That is the anxiety behind this new proposal. If the Thucydides trap is real, then every runway, every alliance, every shared base becomes part of a decades-long effort to prevent it from snapping shut. Lee Kuan Yew once remarked that the size of a country does not determine its destiny, but geography often does. Taiwan is the perfect example. An island of 23 million people, sitting about 130 kilometers from the Chinese coast at its narrowest point, now lives under near constant military pressure. In 2024, Taiwan's defense ministry recorded well over 3,000 PLA aircraft entering its air defense identification zone, more than double the previous year and the highest level yet, with record numbers crossing the Taiwan Strait median line, a boundary China increasingly ignores. Large-scale exercises like Joint Sword 2024A and Joint Sword 2024B encircled the island with warships, aircraft, and missile units, rehearsing blockades and strike operations in multiple directions. In 2025, the PLA followed up with more multi-service drills explicitly framed as punishment for Taiwan's political choices, while aircraft crossings of the median line in early 2025 surged to new monthly records. Against this backdrop, Taiwan's leadership has committed to boosting defense spending from just over 3.3% of GDP next year toward 5% by 2030, including investments in missiles, air defenses, and joint projects with foreign partners. For an island so exposed, strategic depth cannot be found on its own soil alone. It must be created through an external web of bases and partners, which is exactly where Philippine territory enters the picture. The Philippines sits at the scene where two crises could emerge: the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait.
Its northernmost islands and batanes look directly toward Taiwan, while its western coastline opens into contested waters around Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal. This is the kind of geography Robert D. Kaplan calls the fulcrum on which regional order turns, a chain of islands whose control shapes both sea lanes and military access routes. In recent years, Manila has found itself on the front line of China's coercion. Near Scarborough Shoal, Chinese Coast Guard and Navy vessels have collided with each other while aggressively chasing Philippine ships, firing water cannons, and blocking access for Filipino fishermen. These incidents, stacked on top of repeated clashes at Second Thomas Shoal, have pushed the Philippines to invite more joint patrols and exercises with the United States, and increasingly with like-minded partners such as Japan. Philippine leaders have openly acknowledged that any conflict over Taiwan would almost inevitably spill into Philippine waters and airspace, given the geography. That is why bases in northern Luzon are no longer just national assets. They are becoming critical nodes in a wider contest over regional order. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, signed in 2014, quietly transformed the Philippines into a chain of potential forward operating hubs for U.S. and Philippine forces. Under this framework, Washington gained rotational access to 5 key sites: Antonio Bautista Air Base in Palawan, Basa Air Base in Pampanga, Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija, Mactan Benito Abuan in Cebu, and Lumbia Air Base in Cagayan de Oro, forming a north-south lattice for maritime patrols, airlift, and rapid deployment. The real strategic pivot came in 2023 with 4 additional sites, 3 of them in northern Luzon facing the Bashi and Luzon Straits toward Taiwan, and 1 on Balabac Island, guarding the southern entry to the Spratlys. These locations were chosen deliberately. They sit at the dual flashpoints of any future crisis: the Taiwan Strait to the north and the contested waters of the South China Sea to the west. Because geography alone cannot deter threats, the United States has spent the past decade turning these sites into real operational hubs. Washington has committed more than $100 million to EDCA improvements, and recently proposed an additional $128 million to fund over 36 new projects, from runway extensions and hardened shelters to expanded fuel storage and upgraded port and road access. In 2024, it added a separate $500 million defense financing package to boost surveillance, coastal defense, cyber systems, and humanitarian response capabilities tied directly to EDCA locations. A distributed chain of runways, depots, radar nodes, and warehouses designed to allow U.S. and Philippine forces to respond faster than a crisis can escalate, whether at Second Thomas Shoal, around Taiwan, or in the aftermath of a natural disaster. Washington's push for Taiwan to co-finance upgrades at Philippine EDCA bases reflects a fundamental shift in U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, from acting as the region's lone security guarantor to serving as the central coordinator of a web of interconnected alliances. This evolution mirrors other minilateral structures such as AUKUS, the U.S., Japan, South Korea security triangle, and emerging quadrilateral cooperation among the U.S., Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. Integrating Taiwan into EDCA funding spreads the financial burden of deterrence, deepens political interdependence, and makes it far more difficult for Beijing to isolate any single partner. Instead of the old hub-and-spokes model, this new architecture creates overlapping commitments in which allies are literally invested in each other's defensive infrastructure. The geography of northern Luzon and the Batanes Islands explains why the U.S. wants this model now. These territories sit beside the Luzon Strait and Bashi Channel, critical sea lanes through which Chinese aircraft carriers, submarines, and destroyers transit into the Western Pacific. In the past 2 years, the U.S. has treated this corridor as a key pressure point in any Taiwan contingency, deploying naval strike missile, equipped marine units to Batanes during Balakatan 2025, and relocating Typhoon missile launchers, capable of firing Tomahawks and SM-6 interceptors, to Luzon. Local realities reflect this strategic priority. Batanes now hosts regular war games, evacuation drills, and scenario planning in the event of a Taiwan Strait conflict, while Palawan has become a repair and logistics hub for Philippine naval vessels confronting Chinese pressure in the South China Sea. These initiatives, reinforced by the creation of Task Force Philippines, demonstrate that upgraded EDCA sites are not mere construction projects, but the backbone of a distributed, multi-directional U.S.-Philippine operational posture. Cost sharing with Taiwan also reflects domestic realities in both Washington and Taipei. The U.S. has pledged $500 million in military financing and at least $128 million in EDCA infrastructure spending. But these commitments still depend on congressional appropriations. Meanwhile, Taiwan is raising defense spending toward 3.3% of GDP and maintaining a long-term target of 5% by 2030, even as it absorbs major arms acquisitions, from advanced air defenses to upgraded F-16s. Bringing Taipei into EDCA financing allows Washington to stretch limited funds while tying Taiwan more tightly into a shared deterrence ecosystem. Once Taiwanese resources are invested in Philippine bases, its strategic stakes extend beyond the island itself to the broader First Island Chain operating environment. This deepening network of commitments is precisely what Beijing fears. As more countries, from Japan and Australia to Taiwan, link their budgets, exercises, and infrastructure to the Philippines and the United States, any coercion against Taiwan or Manila becomes a challenge to an integrated regional coalition rather than isolated states.
For Taiwan, supporting upgrades to Philippine bases is less about charity and more about survival. Taiwan's cabinet has approved a record defense budget for 2026, around roughly $29 billion, pushing defense spending to about 3.3% of GDP, the highest level in over a decade, and explicitly justified as a response to the growing military threat from across the strait. President Lai Ching-te has publicly set a goal of raising this to 5% of GDP by 2030, aligning Taiwan more closely with NATO-style burden sharing. Rather than pouring all of that money into vulnerable facilities on an island within easy missile range, channeling part of it into hardened, dispersed infrastructure in northern Luzon effectively buys Taiwan strategic depth, runways, depots, and logistics nodes that sit outside the immediate blast radius, but are still close enough to sustain operations in a crisis. This arrangement gives Taiwan an asymmetric advantage.